Hello, I'm Sam Atkinson. This is NSF's Compliance Unlocked. We're here today with Ian White and we're talking about how to prepare for an inspection. Last time, in the last episode, we talked to Lynn Ensor, and that was all about the regulatory landscape. Welcome, Ian.
Thank you.
It's great to have you here today, and one of the features on our podcast is actually to have a question from our current presenter or our speaker, ask our next presenter or speaker. So Lynn actually set us a really nice question for you last time when we spoke with her, and her question was very much around, given your experience as an ex-MHRA expert inspector, what's the most embarrassing moment you've had during that whole time as an inspector, or maybe before when you were interacting with a regulator?
I must thank Lynn for that question. There are many. I think people think that inspectors are infallible. We're not. We make mistakes, we get things wrong. So there are many embarrassing moments where I've had to go in the morning after, own up to something, explain that I misunderstood or I just simply got it wrong. But what stands out in my memory, though, as the most embarrassing moment was inspecting in Japan.
Why is that?
We normally have to order gowns in when we're in some of the Asian countries. People tend to be of smaller frames, so they order us gowns in, and it's not unusual to be wearing a 5XL gown when you gown up for sterile sites. Unfortunately, a site had forgotten to order the gowns in, so we got into the sterile change rooms, and they gave me the biggest gown that they could find, which was not my
big
size.
enough?
No, not my size at all. It left more or less to the imagination than there really should have been. So, yeah, that one stands out for me.
I imagine you went around that particular area of the facility quite quickly.
Yes, but without much movement.
That's brilliant. I love that. And you're right, inspectors, they are human beings at the end of the day, aren't they? And one of the things that we often talk about is how organisations can interact with inspectors, and we shouldn't see them as unusual or odd individuals. They're human beings who are very happy to be challenged or talked to.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think one of my favourite things about being an inspector was when people questioned me.
Yeah.
That opened up a debate about something that I thought was deficient. There are certainly certain parts of the world where respect plays a very important part of the culture, and you would get senior managers reprimanding people for trying to open that dialogue with you. It was something I was always very keen to try and encourage. Partly, we can have those discussions. We're there as inspectors. We can't tell sites how to do things, but there's certain ways in those conversations where you can get over. Okay, that if you just change that slightly, you could move to a more compliant position, or you could do that better. I thoroughly encourage sites to have those discussions, and not simply to accept what an inspector says if they have the evidence that they feel that they're in the right position.
I totally agree, and it's something that's really important, as that sort of relationship you build with your inspector when you're being inspected. But we'll come on more to talk about preparing for inspections. But another interesting thing that I was talking to Lynn about actually was the US FDA's unannounced inspection pilot that they're now doing in sort of their foreign inspections. Do you think that's coming up anywhere else? Do you think other regulators are doing something similar?
I doubt it. I very much doubt it. Unfortunately, there's very few regulators out there that have the same resource and the same in-country teams as the US FDA. I just don't think that at a point in time where agencies are struggling for resource, they're struggling to catch up after the pandemic, I just don't think that the risk-benefit ratio is there to be sending teams overseas to find that they can't actually conduct the inspection for whatever reason. So I don't think we will see that. Unannounced inspections, I think all stringent authorities run them in their own territories, and they're absolutely a useful tool. But sending teams overseas to do it, I don't think so, other than where they've got very specific intelligence and even that's a lottery. So I don't think we'll see that happening.
And that's probably quite comforting news to many, because no one really likes an unannounced inspection. But, that leads us very nicely onto our topic today, which is, being prepared for an inspection. And we talk a lot about inspection readiness. And what do you think about that phrase? Because, I've got mixed views on that, and I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Absolutely. I don't want to come across as naive. I don't want to sit here and preach from some sort of ivory tower. But I've always struggled with the term inspection ready. I think there's connotations behind that we do what we do simply to pass an inspection. And that shouldn't be what we're doing. At the end of the day, it's around patient safety. And if our systems are robust, what we're doing, we're doing that outward look. We're scanning the horizon for changes in the regulatory landscape. We have a means of looking at that, assessing that, seeing what it means for us, and implementing those changes. Then fundamentally we should be inspection ready at any time. It's not a term I like. It's not a term I encourage sites to use.
Yeah, and I totally agree with you. I mean, that's why I say I've got mixed views. But there are things that an organisation can do to be prepared for an inspection, to make sure it's smooth flowing, it's slick, it's effective, it's getting what an inspector needs. What would your advice be for those organisations who have upcoming inspections? So they might already think they're thinking about patient safety all of the time, but they still want to make sure that they really nail that inspection and do the best they can.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of our colleagues, Dave Waddington, spoke about this in an earlier podcast. At the point in time that you're made aware that an inspection's likely, there's very little you can actually do to change what's in your quality system. But there is still a lot that you can do to ensure that inspection runs effectively and efficiently. The way inspections are managed, and by that I mean the inspection, not the inspector, very different. But the way that the inspection is managed is critical. A well-run back room, not a war room. We don't like that term. We don't come to start wars. So a well-run back room that know who the SMEs are. They know where documents are. They can prep people. They can find the appropriate part of the document so that when that SME walks in front of the inspector, they can go straight to what they're looking for. They can walk the inspector through it. The SME's being prepped makes a huge difference. So people confident in what they're doing, backroom that is working well, huge difference in how an inspection can work.
And you said there a moment ago, there's a difference between how you manage the inspection and not the inspector. However, the inspector will respond differently to different activities that you do. So, for example, if you don't provide a document within a timely manner, for example, the inspector is going to respond differently. And that's both in terms of, that talks to running your backroom well, but also managing the expectations of what your inspector is looking for, surely.
Yeah, absolutely. I think certainly from an EMA perspective, we've all worked in industry. We all know that a validation document from X years ago can be at the bottom of a document retention room that's going to go and take some digging out, and that's fine. We can work around that. You just explain it to the inspector, they'll go and do something else. But if it's every document that there's a pause, it tells me that you're either trying to manage the inspection and you're deliberately slowing things down, or your documentation just isn't in a state of control. You can't get hold of what you're looking for in a timely manner. And then that's something I'm going to go digging for.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? And that's a phrase we often hear when we talk about inspections, don't allow them the opportunity to go digging and get sidetracked because, and that again comes down to preparation, doesn't it? If your colleagues around the organisation have perhaps been coached in the right way to respond, to answer questions in the right way, for example, that will also go to help the whole inspection process flow.
Absolutely. And I think mock inspections are a brilliant tool for that. We are at a point in time where inspection windows are becoming lengthier. The regulators aren't visiting sites as often. So those systems potentially aren't as slick as they have been in the past. And running a mock inspection has so many benefits. You can stress test your systems, but I think more value than that, those individuals that may never have been in front of an inspector before get to have that real life experience, but in a safe environment. You can do the hats on, hats off. You can give real time feedback. You can coach them. I understand what you're saying. I have no problem with what you're trying to get across, but maybe don't put it across in that way. Just change your wording slightly. So I think mock inspections are a really useful tool to try and fill that gap where we're not seeing inspections happening quite so frequently.
Yeah, it's a really valid point, especially, as you say, with inspection frequency widening, and that potentially is back down to what we talked about earlier in terms of some of the resource challenges that the inspectorates are having. But just talking about inspections more broadly, what are we seeing in terms of the trends, and where are the findings? Are they still in the same areas they've always been, or are they shifting a little bit at the moment, or is the focus changing of the regulators?
I think pretty much standard.
Same as.
Yeah, unfortunately. I remember pre-pandemic standing up at the symposium saying, please don't let deviations and documentation be the top of the list the next year. And sure enough, the next year came around and I was relaying the same information. And I'm sure if we actually looked at the data, we would see the same thing. So management of deviations, data integrity, and cross-contamination.
Why is data integrity so difficult then? And it shouldn't be. I mean, for me, it's not data integrity anymore; it's data governance, really. But why is data integrity just so difficult to grasp at the moment?
It's a very good question. I think if we understood that, we might be able to knock it out for that top 10 list. I don't think there's been a time of change. We've seen a lot more automation coming in. We're seeing a lot more systems interfacing between each other. And validation hasn't historically really looked at how those systems are interacting, how the information is being passed from one to another. I think there's still a common misbelief that data integrity applies solely to electronic systems. It doesn't. It's just, you can apply it to paper-based systems in exactly the same way. But certainly, as we move to more and more technology, we have AI on the horizon, and the changes that could well bring to our industry. It's understanding behind the scenes, behind what that system is doing that you interact with on a day-to-day basis. What is happening in the background that enables the delivery of that information? What information is stored on that device? How can you retrieve that? Building in security checks, so your system audits, your checks. So I don't know the answer.
It is a tricky area, and it's one that the regulators are still focusing on very much, and
Absolutely.
actually going down the line of culture as well, aren't they? I mean,
Yeah.
Let's not delve too much into that at the moment, but that is certainly another focus, I think, which is perhaps the foundations of perhaps some of the challenges we're seeing in this area. But you talked then a moment ago about self-checks and things like that, so self-inspections I wanted to ask you about. How can they benefit an organisation getting ready for an inspection?
Well, again, I think, as we see this period between inspections increasing, self-inspections become an increasingly important tool. We should never be delegating our responsibilities. Self-inspections, you you know more about what happens on your site than the inspectors, and therefore you can be far more targeted in your self-inspection program. And that's one of the things that certainly the regulators are looking for, and also those more forward-looking organisations. How can we really make value of that self-inspection program? Personally, the day that we see the last self-inspection program, which is designed around going to every operational area once a year, the sooner that disappears, the better. The sooner it becomes utilising good QMR, focusing on risk, the better. It never ceases to amaze me, the amount of data that we generate as an industry and then fail to use it. That baffles me as scientists. As engineers, we're great at generating data, and then we just seem not to actually do anything with it in a lot of cases. So a good self-inspection program designed around QMR principles. So we're using that finite resource that we have as the inspection team or the audit team, and we're targeting our areas of risk. We're targeting both what poses the greatest risk to the patient, but also what our data is telling us are areas of risk. I think the sooner that we move to that kind of self-inspection program, the better.
I can see that would add real value. I mean, talk to me a bit more about risk and risk assessments particularly, because risk assessments, I know over the years we've certainly had lots of conversations about risk assessments and the use of them, or more to the point, perhaps not the best use of them all the time. When can they be a real benefit, and when can they perhaps not be used in the most effective way?
I think it's a relief to me as a former inspector that ICHQ 9 has now made it very clear you cannot risk assess yourself out of a regulatory requirement, because I think where there has historically been a practice of, yes, we know that's what we need to do, but we'll raise a risk assessment and say why we're doing what we're doing is okay. We don't need to comply with that. So it's now very clear you cannot do that. Hopefully, we can draw a line in that sand and in the sand and move on from there. Risk assessments, absolutely key to what we do. We do see good risk assessments. Where we tend to see them fall down, though, is that they're not revisited. They're very much done in isolation. They're done at a moment in time to assess something, and then they're put away as part of a report or as part of a deviation, and they never come back to reassess that risk. We're also very bad at knowledge sharing. So we'll do a risk assessment, we'll come up with a conclusion. Great, it's there, but we don't share that amongst the people that are doing that operation.
Yeah, I can see that's not exactly what an inspector wants to see either, if you think about when they come around and look at those risk assessments. Which brings me on to another question, really. And when an inspector comes, you obviously want to be prepared and share with them certain things. If you've got a potential high-risk issue, or if you've got something perhaps that you're controlling, but you still feel that they may come across it. And obviously it might be a better opportunity for you to share it early rather than later. And a lot of organisations talk about things like storyboarding and so on. I mean, perhaps you can just talk us through how an organisation can prepare for some of those situations.
So again, I mean, there's a range of tools. I'm a real advocate of risk logs. I think risk logs are a really powerful tool to both for the site, to manage their risks on a day-to-day basis, but also to be able to turn around to the inspector and say, we've identified the risk. Those are the mitigating actions that we have in place now, and this is where we want to move to. We have the controls. We can identify if there are any changes in that risk factor. So we are moving to a better position, but we've got a good understanding of it here and now. So I think QA risk logs from that perspective, really, really useful. You can prioritise your risks. Again, basis of QMR, we know we've got finite resource. Let's focus on those most significant risks. So the risk log gives you a nice order of risk scores, and you can then target those commensurate to the risk.
Yeah, no, that sounds really good. And like you say, there's a range of tools out there that can really support organisations, aren't there, really moving forward. Do you have any particular experiences of unusual circumstances when an inspector has come to visit perhaps an organisation you're supporting, or even in fact one of your own when you went along to a site? Did you come across any unusual risks?
I mean, the risks are specific to sites, aren't they? So, and it depends how they want to use certainly tools like the risk log. So I've seen sites that throw everything onto the risk log. So you can see risk of earthquakes, risk of flooding, risk of, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. It's a good tool to help you identify and manage risks and really to put it into the context of the risk that it poses. So unusual, maybe not so, but what you see from site to site is really what's interesting, and how when you think you understand how a model should be used, you turn up on site and go, oh, okay, you use it like that. It's always interesting. It's always interesting to see the difference between how sites can use the same tool.
Yeah, no, I can see that. I mean, my last question to you, and take a moment to think about this. I'd love to hear your sort of 3 highest top tips, but I'll come to you in a moment for the answer. But just if I can share, one situation I had with the whole risk element is that sometimes you don't always see risks being, I guess, escalated upwards in the right way. And actually, I think for organisations to understand the difference between the impact of that when a risk is sent up to the right place for a decision versus not is also really critical when preparing for an inspection. So that would certainly be something I would be looking at and advising organisations to think about. But top tips, Ian. How would you prepare? Go on.
I just pick up on
Please
that point.
do, yeah.
I think it absolutely echo that. It amazed me the number of times that as an inspector I would go to one site within an organisation's portfolio. I'd go and I'd give them a deficiency for X. I'd go, right, please sort that. And you would get the CAPA plan and you'd go, yeah, no problem with that. Excellent. And then you would go and audit or inspect another one of their facilities and you'd pick up on exactly the same thing. So site A had learned the lesson, they'd put corrective actions in, but it hadn't been escalated, it hadn't been communicated across the entire organisation, and therefore the second site is getting pinged for exactly the same thing. So, yeah I think that's disappointing when that happens, and then you have to start considering, is this systematic across the organisation rather than an isolated event?
Mm-hmm. So getting the information to the right place for action to be taken. Yeah, those broadly my points, but you put it very eloquently. Thank you. So top tips then for organisations to prepare for an inspection.
Data. Use your data. I can't tell you the number of times that I've requested data, done some really basic data analysis, and know more about a system within a matter of minutes than the site. It's not a comfortable position for the host to be in when I know more than them. And I think as an inspector, the most concerning thing is always when you start picking up things that the site are blind of. So use your data.
Yep.
Second, it's very easy for me to sit here and say it, but be open, be transparent in the way that you host the inspection. Just really silly things like visual factory boards. Why wipe a visual factory board clean before an inspector walks around? It's quite clear it's there for a purpose. I think visual factory boards are a great tool.
Great things, yeah, absolutely.
They can show how you're proactively managing things, and particularly, if you're not all over that system. If that system isn't operating where you would expect it to be, it's a really useful tool to be able to say, this is how we're tackling it. It rings alarm bells when I was walking around facilities and everything's being wiped clean.
Yeah.
It says a lot about the culture, and it says a lot about how they want to interact with their inspector. So, yes, it's an inspection. Yes, you want to pass, but that relationship that you can build through being open and transparent with the inspector, very important. And third, I think would be just taking that time to step back and think about the inspection process itself. What we all know, deviations are going to be looked at, validation master plan are going to be looked at. There are things that you can absolutely guarantee that the inspectors will be requesting. There should be no reason at all you can't lay your hands on those things.
Goes back to that backroom logistics, doesn't it? And the whole planning and preparation.
Yeah. But equally, thinking as an inspector before I left, we were seeing more and more sites allowing laptops as the tool. We see more and more document management systems, and we're all kind of more conscious about our environmental impact. And it horrified me as I walk off site and see all this paper that had been printed out that was just going for shredding. So, sites are increasingly giving laptops to inspectors. Make sure you've turned off notifications. The number of times I've seen Teams messages pop up, my favourite ever being, don't show the inspector this. You can guess what my next request was.
Asked for it.
So, I think, prep, challenge your systems, do a dry run, be that with an external organisation doing your mock inspection, or if you've got the advantage of a corporate team, come through, challenge those systems, make sure it's going to run. There's no worse time than to find a system doesn't operate as you thought it would
during an inspection.
Through an inspection, yeah.
Get that. Brilliant. Thank you, Ian. As we started with a question for you from our previous guest, I'm going to ask you the same thing. Could you have a question for our next guest, or do you have a question for our next guest?
Absolutely. So, as we spoke, I used to quite enjoy being challenged as an inspector. So I would like to pose the question, have you ever disagreed with an inspector or an investigator? And if so, how did you go about that and what was the outcome? Fantastic,
thank you. And just for our listeners, our next guest is actually Mike Hydock, who's also from NSF. And we'll be talking about inspection remediation in our next episode. But thank you again, Ian. It's been really great to talk to you today. I'm Sam Atkinson. This has been Compliance Unlocked.